Good evening and welcome to the Pompey Politics Podcast.
I'm Ian Tiny Morris.
And I'm Simon Sansbury.
And welcome to 2024 and the first edition of the Pompey Politics Podcast. The astute amongst you are listening live might notice that we do pre-record that bit, so it's not quite evening, even though the light is fading at just 20 past 2 on a Sunday afternoon. So great to be back and lovely to have a couple of fantastic guests and friends of the podcast. So Simon, welcome back. New year?
Yes.
All full of aspirations, or are all those New Year's resolutions already in tatters?
I've kind of learned enough by now not to bother making any because I always break them. But I guess the best resolution this year would be a change of government, right?
Oh, stop it! Oh, somebody had a dodgy Christmas. I thought he'd wait a little bit, but anyway, go on, introduce our guests.
So we are joined this afternoon. Yes, as our regular listeners will notice, we're a slight detour from our normal schedule. So we're joined this afternoon by the fabulous two of the three fabulous councillors for Charles Dickens Ward in Portsmouth. So we're joined with Councillor Corkery.
Good afternoon, everyone.
And Councillor Yinka Adeniran.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Okay, welcome both. So just to remind anybody that doesn't know about Charles Dickens Ward, so it literally is the very, very heart of the city. It contains the commercial road, Buckland, Portsea Victoria Park, the historic dockyard, the birthplace of Charles Dickens, hence the name of the ward. And it is also a place where lots of the high-rise student housing is in the city, as well as the obviously encompassing the part of the entrance to the city, which is the M275. And the clean air zone. So we will get into all of those things once we're hearing a bit more from our wonderful guests. So should we crack straight into the questions, Ian?
Let's do it.
Okay. So if such a thing exists, what is a typical day in the life of a Charles Dickens councillor? And if I can ask that first to Yinka.
Yes, thank you so much. And once again, good afternoon. I remember I first featured in your on live with you shortly before I got elected in 2022. And this is my first interview again with you. And the first thing will be to thank all the residents in Charles Dickens for getting me elected in 2022, for putting their trust in me, to represent them, to be their voice in the community. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for inviting me. It is a really, really great pleasure to be here this afternoon. Yes, thank you. Going back to the question, I would say it's very busy and varied. It all depends on what I have on my diary for the day. And that's why I say it's varied, because sometimes I started with going into checking my emails, going for the meetings, if it's briefings, and if it's online. Sometimes we have online meetings, we have face-to-face, in person, whereby we have to go to the council for the meeting. Then checking the emails and anything related to council or attending community events, if you have one, and it can be from one event to another or from one meeting to another. And even apart from that, being a mother of three and a chief executive officer of a company, it can be very, very, very busy for me. And sometimes visiting residents in case if I have to do follow-up on cases, on casework at my hands. And each day, sometimes what I normally do, I try to end my day by updating what I've done on the social media, or if there's any news or any information that needs to go out to the resident. I try to do that at the end of the day before going to bed. So it can be really, really very busy, but it depends on each day, because sometimes on Wednesday of every month, that is when I do have my advice surgery. So that means that day is going to be different from others. So, but it can be very busy and varied. Thank you.
That's fine. Thank you very much. So very busy and varied. Cal, did you have anything more to add on that one? How's the day in the life of a councillor for you?
I think Yinka's given quite a comprehensive summary there, so I won't go back over what's already been said. But I guess the only thing I would add is that myself, Yinka, and Kirsty, the other ward councillor, we all live within the ward. So for me, there's no such thing as kind of going to work as a councillor, because we're almost always on duty, whether it's kind of chatting to our neighbours as we're coming and going from our properties, attending local community centre, going shopping, popping into the local pub. All of this for me, all this kind of day-to-day stuff is an important part of being a councillor and really being rooted in the community, knowing what the issues are and kind of engaging with our residents and our neighbours on a regular basis.
Okay, thank you very much.
So, Cal, if I just to look at the next issue. So, when you're engaging with those residents, what are the key issues that people are bringing forward to you, and are they a mix of sort of national and local issues? Because I know often councillors are viewed as being able to change and make everything better. So, what is it that you're hearing when you're talking to the residents?
So the top issue that I will speak to people about, or that people will come to speak to me about, is always housing. I think that's partly because the housing crisis does particularly affect Charles Dickens Ward. So something like 70% of people live within social housing, which is one of the highest rates of any council ward in the country. I think top 4 last time I looked it up. So there's lots of people living within social housing, lots of people often overcrowded, have issues with repairs and maintenance, needing to reach out for help. Also lots of issues with homelessness of people who are trying to get housed. My background previously was working in social housing and homelessness services, so I had a bit of kind of experience and knowledge I was able to bring to the table in terms of supporting people around that. So yeah, as I say, it does mean that I end up speaking to a lot of people about the housing crisis and how we can try and support people to resolve their issues. Now, obviously, we can't always do that, unfortunately. So sometimes part of it is around managing people's expectations, explaining to people how the social housing waiting list works, what their options might be otherwise. But reasonably often there are ways in which we can support people, even if it's just kind of breaking down those communication barriers. People may feel that they have previously reached out for help but been turned away or not got the answer they thought they should have. So quite often we can kind of advocate for people by knocking on the right doors, having those conversations and ensuring that they're getting what they're entitled to and the kind of support that they need to try and address those issues. Outside of that, I guess, again, I'll try not to take all the issues, Yinka. So maybe I'll stick with housing, because that is by far and away the number one issue that I deal with and I speak to people on a daily basis.
Just a little follow-up question on that, Cal. Obviously, you've been in a councillor now for 5 years, and you know the cuts to local authority spending have been there. But there's also been a lot of work in Portsmouth to support the homeless. Would you say, sort of 5 years on, that things are getting better? Getting worse, or do the problems just vary and change over time?
I think the service provision has changed a lot from when I was first elected, previous to that, kind of when I was working in homelessness services and kind of campaigning on those issues. The big turning point around those changes was the pandemic. So people may remember that near the start of the pandemic, when the kind of lockdowns were starting to come into effect, the government suddenly realised that if they wanted to click their fingers and abolish homelessness overnight, they could do it. And they brought in a policy called Everyone In, which mandated local authorities to basically offer all rough sleepers the opportunity to get off the streets kind of there and then. And in Portsmouth, that looks like a hotel, and at one point a couple of hotels being taken over by local authority and homelessness services, particularly or specifically for the provision of accommodation to people who would otherwise be on the streets. I think that wasn't always perhaps done in for the right reasons. I think there was probably a public health concern around having people out and about during a lockdown. But for whatever reasons were, the positives were that lots of rough sleepers were given accommodation. That then developed, so there was money made available for the next stages, because quite rightly people were saying, well, look, you've suddenly abolished street homelessness, more or less, brought all these people into hotels, now what? So there was money available, made available for the next steps. And in Portsmouth, that enabled the local authority to buy 3 former student accommodation blocks, 1 in the city centre and 2 along Elm Grove, which off the top of my head was something like 100 bed spaces. So quite a significant expansion of kind of temporary shared accommodation available for people. And that has made a big difference, because that does mean, obviously there's always exceptions to the rule, but on the whole, if there is a rough sleeper who is willing to go into that kind of accommodation, then usually that can be facilitated within a reasonably short period of time. That wasn't necessarily the case prior to the pandemic. So that's been a massive step forward in terms of the provision for rough sleepers. Without getting too much into detail, I think there's still a bit of a hole or a missing part within that provision, because it assumes that people are willing or able to go and live in that type of accommodation. And by the nature of it, that type of accommodation can sometimes be quite chaotic because of the people that live in there, the backgrounds, the lifestyles they might be leading. So quite often the most vulnerable people perhaps might choose or say that they're unable to go into that accommodation. So I still think there's work to be done around ensuring that we're meeting the needs of everyone that's a rough sleeper that needs help. But certainly a massive step forward for that particular part of the homeless community. And I'll just finish on, because I could talk about this all day, but I'll try not to. I'll just finish on saying that something I always try to put across is that the homelessness crisis is kind of massive and varied. And although people will naturally, the first thing they'll think of is the rough sleeper they've seen on the street corner, etc. That is just part of it, and I like to say that's the tip of the iceberg, because it's the part that's visible, the part that you can see, but actually beneath the waterline there's this massive expanse that's probably many times more than the rough sleeper population of people who are hidden homeless, who are perhaps sofa surfing or in unsafe or unsuitable accommodation. And for those people, I don't think much has changed in the time I've been a counsellor, and in fact I would arguably say that it's got worse.
A mixed picture then, Callum, and your passion for the subject comes through. So if I might turn to Yinka, what are the residents of Charles Dickens highlighting to you as their biggest issues?
Thank you. Anyway, Cllrs just mentioned one out of many. I'm just going to add 1 or 2 more. But with the housing, we have like young families with over, when you have like five member of a family grown up children in a like 1-bedroom flat, that is one of the issue we are facing. So they all want decent accommodation. Apart from that, another thing is antisocial behavior. In most cases, when I'm at my advice surgery, a lot of residents working, most of their concern is to complain about antisocial behavior and then fly tipping. So this is just quite a number of things that we are dealing with at Charles Dickens Ward. But those are the main issue: antisocial behavior, flying tipping, and housing problems.
So again, a little follow-up question with the antisocial behaviour and the fly tipping. Are you getting the support that you would want as a local councillor to tackle those kind of behaviours? Because they came up very strongly in last year's hustings in so many wards in Portsmouth. So are you getting the support that you'd be looking for?
Not all the time, because sometimes we are limited to what we can do. If the resident comes like that, what we normally do is to get in touch, because we are their voice anyway, is to write the email to the officer at the council. But not all the time we are getting a positive result. It has to be like ongoing issue. You revisit and you revisit and you revisit, and there's no end to it. But to some extent, we try to do what we can to alleviate the problem, but not all the time we are getting the positive results. I must say.
Perfect. Thank you, Yinka. Simon.
Okay. Staying with Yinka to make it easy to rather than keep swapping backwards and forwards. So I mentioned on it in the introduction. So the ward's got quite a proliferation of student tower blocks. That there's often seems to be kind of doing the rounds about the redevelopment of Commercial Road or the stuff around kind of certain parts of the city centre. Do you feel that the ward and its residents benefit or suffer from and I've been a bit playful with the language there of being a planner's and a developer's kind of playground? It seems to be a place where all of these things kind of happen, but are they for the benefit or not for the people that live there, do you think?
I know for any development or redevelopment, there's always pros and cons.
Mm-hmm.
And with this, to be honest, we don't really need student building again in that high street, because it's high street. And if you look at it, that is why most of the shop owners, they are leaving, like Button, Dorothy Perkins, because there's nothing attractive to the tourists that we want them to visit city center. It's a high street, and we want them to treat it. So if you go to Southampton, they have a big shopping mall and all that, which we want to see. And mostly that is what the residents are complaining about. When I first came to you, I will not go to city center. There was Debenhams there. This is very attractive. But now everything, and a lot of residents, if they wouldn't want a student accommodation anymore. We have a lot of empty houses for the students that they are not even used. And most especially now that we don't really have more international students coming in because of the rules and regulation that conservative just put across now. So it's a bit difficult to have even international students coming into the country to build student accommodation again. So we need affordable and decent housing for all the residents. And personally, that is the way I look at it. And that is what the residents are actually speaking about. That instead of them looking for that, they are not, I don't think is the right thing to do. And the resident actually doesn't like it that way. They want to see decent and affordable accommodation instead. Or do the city center, make it more attractive for the tourists to come in for the shopping.
Okay, lovely, thank you. And Cal, your thoughts on that one, please.
Again, probably coming from a pretty similar position, but I think there's a couple of points I would add. I think the first to mention is that this isn't just an issue of student accommodation. I think it's a particular type of student accommodation, the model that's being pushed in a lot of these blocks. It's luxury, high-end, kind of really expensive student accommodation. But they may have an on-site gym. I've seen ones with on-site canteens, cinemas, really amazing facilities and probably quite good places to live if you're happy to be stuck in a shoebox when you're sleeping and doing most of your other stuff. But I think the point I would make there is that there's an impact also on students, that the students are almost being forced to feel that they need to live in this type of accommodation, at least in their first year, and pay often hundreds of pounds a week. It's really expensive. And the only way in which developers are facilitated to charge such large amounts is because students will receive their maintenance loans. And obviously that goes up year by year, which has put them further and further in debt. Their maintenance loan comes in, goes straight out again on this expensive accommodation. So I think that there's a lot to be asked there around why we're using debt given by the government put onto students to pay back in the future in order to facilitate these private developers from making expensive luxury accommodation and a lot of money out of it at the same time. Now, I know there's a lot of pushback, often, probably always, when we speak to residents about what's going on within the area. Every time a new block goes up, people quite rightly ask those questions of, why is this accommodation for students? Why isn't there something for my cousin who's homeless, my sister and her kids who are in an overcrowded flat, et cetera, kind of real social and affordable housing for the people who live in Portsmouth that need that type of accommodation? Now, one point it's always worth making is that it's not the council building the student accommodation, because there often is a lot of confusion around that. People ask, well, why is the council doing this? Why aren't they building social housing instead? More often than not, these are privately owned sites. They go up for sale. Who buys it? It's the person that can offer the most money. The person that can offer the most money is the person that's going to make the most profit out of that site. And at the moment, the way the market is that the most profitable thing to do is to build student accommodation. That's why it's happening. But I do think the council can play, and probably should play, a stronger role in the kind of placemaking function through planning and through its other powers of trying to control or at least influence how land is used, and move it towards more socially useful uses, away from this kind of expensive luxury accommodation that I don't think really benefits many people in the long run, apart from the shareholders of those big developers, and more towards what local people want and need. And obviously that's about affordable social accommodation, but it's also, as Yinka said, about re-energising the high street, bringing kind of businesses and shops that people want to go and spend their money in and spend time in back to commercial roads, so that it can try and kind of restore the reputation that it used to have as a really viable commercial centre.
Okay, lovely. And I guess that's the change in high streets is a thing that lots of other high streets are struggling with. Is it what do you think kind of works in that regard? Because gone are the days where half the city would pile into a commercial centre of a Saturday. That kind of shopping environment's changed. What do you think that kind of looks like now?
Well, I think clearly there's a shift away from the kind of large shopping centres like Debenhams, etc., Marks and Spencers, that used to be very prominent in years gone by. I think where councils are succeeding in re-energising high streets, it's about facilitating spaces that are maybe not just about shopping. They're also about perhaps eating out, having a drink, kind of other kind of social activities that draw people into a space. And maybe while they're there, they might pop to the shop next door and spend a few quid as well. Obviously, also housing comes with that, because if you've got people living above shops, then clearly that's going to benefit the kind of footfall for those businesses. I also think it's about the size of units. So again, looking at where regeneration has worked, I think it's about creating kind of smaller spaces, maybe that are exempt from business rates under the current system, have much cheaper rents, and much more affordable for people who are maybe just starting out as a small business, to get in there, kind of establish themselves and start to build up a customer base. Now, I think if you look at, I think Albert Road is a good example of this. I know Albert Road benefits from being within a kind of much wealthier postcode, but there's also the positive benefits in terms of having small individual units that people can come in and afford to take on and set up their business and become successful. So I think going forward, in terms of kind of planning and development, we need to look at try and create those smaller retail units where people who are setting up small businesses from the local community can maybe come in at cheap rates, maybe be exempt from business rates, and try to establish themselves and draw people back into the area.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. Ian?
So 2024 looks like a big year politically. We've got local elections in May, and all the fun and games of the hustings we look to organise. And according to Rishi, a general election in the second half of next year. So Cllrs, as an independent, and I think Kirsty has announced that she's going to stand down this year, who's your colleague within your group of sort of independents. Is it a year off for you, or do you see yourself being involved in any local or national election campaigning?
Well, the prospect of a year off sounds pretty appealing, if I'm honest, as someone who's committed. Probably, I was thinking about it the other day, that my last 9 years, I think maybe it was 1 year off where we didn't have elections, but the other 8 have kind of been spent mostly out pounding the streets, knocking on people's doors, involved in various political campaigns. But I think the general election clearly is a significant opportunity for us to change the way in which this country is run. I don't think probably surprise many people to say that I'm particularly enamoured with the current Labour Party and its leadership, and in particular, because for me it's not about individuals, it's about policies, and the policies that are on offer, I think, are falling short of what we need and what we want to see to really kind of transform the country and provide a radical change to the way in which the Conservatives have been governing. But having said that, I think the Labour Party is still by far and away the best of the two options that we do have realistically under first past the post for who's going to be running the country. I think the Tories have run the country into the ground. I think clearly there is a massive appetite for change, because without doing very much, the Labour Party has attracted a significant poll lead. And I think that is showing that people want to change. People want the Conservatives out of government and they want a different way forward. I guess my hope is that once in power, and I think that will be what happens, Keir Starmer and the Labour Party are at least open to having conversations and listening to the likes of the trade unions, the likes of the kind of social movement campaigns and other progressive organisations and causes within the country who do have lots of good ideas and lots of policies that are good to go for how we can really change the country for the better. I know that's not really on offer at the moment, but I at least think one positive I will say is that I will think they will be more open to listening and having a conversation around those issues than the Conservatives have been for the past 13 years.
So playing it coy there as to whether you'll be lacing up your campaigning trainers later in the year.
We'll see.
We'll see. So Yinka, obviously, as a member of the Labour Party, do you see yourself having a busy year of campaigning?
Yeah, of course. I see myself playing an active and supportive role in both campaigns. So I will work hard to promote the I will work hard to promote the achievements and policies of my party and colleagues, and most especially to support Stephen Moga, MP, our MP, to get re-elected and possibly to win the seat at the North. Because, as Carl said, everybody, all the citizens are fed up, they are tired, they want changes, and it's only Labour that can do it. It's only Labour that we have been waiting for. Things are just going down every time, each day. So definitely people are already fed up, and then we need change. And this is the time to do that. So I'm going to be very, very busy, cooperating and coordinating with the other candidates and campaigners in the ward and in constituency as a whole, leafletting, door knocking, all sorts of things to make sure Labour get into the power. Thank you.
No worries, Yinka. And I guess my question is that as an activist and campaigner, and I know part of the answer would be the general election can't come soon enough. Would you have preferred both elections to have been going ahead in May, or do you think it suits Labour better to have two different elections?
To be honest, we want it as soon as possible, even if it is before May. It's what we have been waiting for, and we're already out every day, every time to canvass, engaging our residents and all that. So either in May or anytime, we just want it as soon as possible.
And can I just jump in on that one?
Of course you can, Cal.
I think that's an interesting question, and various conversations that I've had over the past month or so that won't be disclosed with who, but I think the feeling on the council is that should the general election coincide with the local elections, that will have a really significant impact and make a big difference to the local election results. I think there are people who are maybe not part of the two national parties, or not part of the Labour Party at least, who are got everything crossed that it will be later on in the year, because then they can portray the local elections as just local elections, just about who's running the council, just about who's doing best for the local community. I think if the local elections and the general election happen on the same day, which seems quite unlikely now, but if that were to be the case, I think obviously national politics would get massively drawn into the local election campaign, and more than likely Labour would do a lot better than they might otherwise if the two elections are taken apart.
Yeah, no, I think it's a fascinating. It's something we've mused on, and I think, I think the two main parties would perhaps benefit much more strongly for the two being linked. Whereas obviously, if we look at last year's elections, it was the Lib Dems and the Portsmouth Independents, as well as yourself, who probably had the better of the night. So we will see how it all unfolds. So Simon,
It depends on. I guess our working assumption is that we'll find out when we find out, but
that's what we're planning for.
We're planning for whenever someone wakes up and says, today's a good day to go. So where did we get to? Okay, so the clean air zone. So the clean air zone covers a large part of the ward, as I mentioned at the top of the show. You've got the M275, one of the only three entrances into the city, coming in through. Is the clean air zone a good thing for residents, and has it made a difference? And if I can get that first to Cal, if that's all right.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. I've been supportive of the clean air zone. In fact, I've argued that it probably hasn't gone far enough. I think it has had an impact. Clearly, there has been a deterrent effect for those older commercial vehicles, such as the big HGVs. There wasn't, I think, a massive amount of them, but there was a small number of older vehicles which would have been liable for the clean air zone charges, who have been caught up in this, and the organisations that own those vehicles have now got a reasonable incentive to upgrade their vehicles to something that's more efficient in order to avoid the charge, which clearly is good. My concerns at the time were that it wasn't expansive enough. I think when you do a smaller area, particularly in somewhere like Portsmouth, you're inevitably going to have displacement effects. That means that someone who might own a vehicle or is driving a vehicle and responsible for that charge, if they know they can't go in through the bottom of the M275, then they probably may well be kind of encouraged to go down Eastern Roads or come down London roads, in Kingston Road, Fratton Road, etc. The initial proposals for the smaller scheme that we've currently got actually did, for that reason, I think, include Fratton Road and Kingston Road, which is one of the main kind of road corridors through the centre of the city, and actually probably the main road corridor that most people live around. So clearly not that many people live directly on the Eastern Road, although some do. Similarly with the M275, lots and lots of people do live directly on Fratton Road and Kingston Road and travel up and down it and across it every day. So I thought it was really important that that should be included. In the end, the Lib Dems unfortunately did exempt Fratton Road and Kingston Road from the clean air zone after being lobbied to do so by businesses who were concerned about the impacts on their financials. So I think it could have gone further. I think it's been a good thing. It's probably made a marginally positive impact, but I think it could go a lot further. And also, just to also mention, because lots of people were concerned, and even to this day are concerned about clean air zones and the impacts it may have on them and their families. The type of clean air zone that's been implemented in Portsmouth applies only to commercial vehicles. So it's not including your average family car. It's not even including your kind of small white van that a self-employed sparky or carpenter, etc., might use on a daily basis. It is primarily the large commercial vehicles such as HGVs, which are typically owned by big national companies who I'm sure can either afford the charge or hopefully will not want to pay the charge and put their hands in their pocket to upgrade their vehicles and stop polluting our air so much.
Okay, thank you. Yinka, your thoughts on the clean air zone, good or bad thing for the residents?
I'm just going to add one or two things with what Kai just said. Well, I've noticed a reduction in the traffic volume and the emission level in the world, to be honest. And recently, we tried to create awareness by going to schools and encourage people cycle to school, the children cycle to school, walking instead of mob. And it's just part of all this clean air zone just to make sure the pollution with vehicle is reduced. So I can just say I think I can see the little changes, but we are not there yet. And then we are still waiting for the data, because normally I can't remember again, but we are waiting on the data to see through the data if it has been reduced or not. But it has not. We are not yet. I'm not yet know the data yet, but it has been reduced greatly.
I must admit, I thought some was due out in November, but I hadn't seen any. So it's quite interesting that there hasn't been any any data yet. It's been in place a while now, so you'd have thought there'd be something there to be able to demonstrate either it has or it hasn't made the difference that it was intended. So it's in that way what you described. It's kind of, and forgive the pun, it's been the catalyst for changing some behaviours around other transport decisions that will also help with traffic congestion and help with pollution and health and well-being actually within the ward. Is that that sounds like a good opportunity? Okay, it's great. Thank you.
So if we look at Charles Dickens Ward, it's got a lot of fantastic sort of reminders of Portsmouth's past, in the dockyard and surrounding it. I guess what part do you think the Charles Dickens Ward will play in Portsmouth's future? And if I can ask that first to Yinka.
I know Charles Dickens is an historic and cultural ward with many landmarks, monuments, monuments and buildings that reflect the rich and diverse heritage of the city. But what I can actually say that is, I think the Charles Dickens is a word that preserve the past, shape the present, and inspire the future of the city. That is all what I can say about that question.
No, that's perfect. So Cal, what do you see as what part is the Charles Dickens Ward's going to play in the future of Portsmouth? What would it look like in a few years' time?
So one thing in particular that I think is going to be massive within the city, but particularly within Charles Dickens Ward, is the kind of decarbonisation works that are going to be necessary in order for us as a country, us as a civilization, to meet the net zero challenge. As I mentioned earlier, something like 70% of people within Charles Dickens Ward live within social housing. Typically, those are within, or if not almost exclusively, within blocks of flats, mostly low to mid-rise, but also some high-rise blocks as well. They were typically built in the 50s, 60s and 70s. Clearly now aging, still providing kind of decent accommodation for lots of people, but definitely aging in terms of their energy efficiency, and definitely in need of massive upgrades and renewal in terms of those kind of decarbonisation works. So I think there's a massive opportunity there. It's more than an opportunity, actually. It's a necessity for probably billions of pounds worth of work to be done. And what I'd like to see in terms of turning that into an opportunity is ensuring that local people benefit from that. So clearly people will benefit from their homes being better insulated. But the questions that I have been asking already and want to continue asking is, who's going to be doing this work? Where are the skilled apprenticeships going to be? There's lots of people within our area, lots of young people who are stuck in kind of dead ends, low paid jobs. We could create hundreds of really kind of skilled apprenticeships and opportunities, setting people up for life in the types of work that's going to be needed to kind of improve their homes. So I think there's a really big opportunity there in terms of decarbonisation of the social housing stock across the ward. I also think clearly there's hopefully going to be a lot of money going into the city centre in terms of the regeneration that's centred around the former Tricorn site. I know it's a kind of topic that lots of people roll their eyes at, because there have been various proposed regeneration schemes that have never really taken off. And I'll certainly share that frustration. hopefully we do seem to now be taking some steps towards that. I know that the first phase of the council's plan has been granted planning permission, so hopefully that will progress. And again, I think what I'd like to see is local residents really being at the heart of that. I think it's important that we're not just placing a new community kind of isolated from the rest of the ward, plopping it into the middle of the city centre. It needs to be something that is kind of genuinely linked to the existing communities and also genuinely to the benefit of those communities. So again, that's something I've been pushing for and will continue to do so and keep a close eye on.
Brilliant. Thank you, Cal. Simon.
Okay, so our next question, and I'll put this one first to Cal. So, what change or achievement are you most proud of in your time as councillor? Obviously, you've been a councillor longer than Yinka, but still, what's your best achievement?
So, a key priority for me, and something that I'd like to think we've done a reasonable amount of work on and made some progress around, is trying to empower kind of people and community groups within the area to play more of a role in how their area is governed. So yeah, it's great that people have chosen us to be their ward councillors, but I don't think it's then just for us to go away and speak on behalf of people or say this is what the community really needs or wants. So the way in which I've tried to put that into practice is all about kind of empowering people to be actively involved in these various projects or in the various ways in which their area may be changing or developing. So for me, that's always about pushing kind of genuine engagement in projects. So when I go to briefings, meetings, when I'm being talked about about new projects, the first question, or definitely first or second, is what involvement have we got with local residents around this? And sometimes it may be, oh, well, we have done some consultation. So great, that's better than no consultation. But for me, a survey or a focus group is quite different to actually actively involving people within those projects. So I will always say, why can't we have residents on the governing boards for this project? Why can't we have residents on the kind of board of directors for these new community groups we're setting up? And in a similar vein, something that we always try to push is encouraging people to set up residents groups and residents associations. And we try to play kind of role as facilitators within that. So if someone comes to us and say, look, there's real problems with our block, we've got X, Y, and Z going on, no one's listening to us. Quite often we'll go speak to a neighbour and they'll say the same thing, and their neighbour will also say the same thing. But they've been trying to deal with it as individuals. So they've spoken to the housing office or they've made complaints and they've perhaps not got where they wanted to. So our suggestion is always, well, why don't we bring you together with your neighbours who have got the same concerns to set up some kind of collective organisation, a residents association or something of that type, because together you've got a much stronger voice, and together we can support you to lobby the council or whatever authority it is to get the resources and the focus needed to deal with the issue. So yeah, I guess in general, the point I'm making is about, for me, it's very much about empowering people to come together, take control over their own lives and influence those outcomes, and not just rely on elected representatives or council officers or whoever it may be, but actually kind of take up that mantle and do part of the work themselves.
And if I can ask a cheeky follow-on, do you think that the absence of that is kind of behind the ward having the lowest voter turnout in elections, or do you think it's other things?
I think it plays a role, definitely. I mean, I know for a fact, because we get the data from who is voted, clearly not who they voted for, but we can see whether someone's voted or not in the last election. And I know from reviewing that yeah, the blocks that have got a strong community focus, that have got a regular residents meeting or a regular coffee morning, that more often than not we're able to engage with in various ways, they tend to have higher voter turnouts and higher engagement within those elections, because they are naturally coming together anyway to discuss the issues in their area. So I guess it's a kind of natural progression for them, if there's an election coming up, to have those conversations and have a bit more engagement within the process.
Okay, lovely, thank you. Yinka, what are you most proud of in your time as councillor?
Thank you. Anyway, one of the things Kai just mentioned is about forming resident association with the residents, because we believe a tree cannot make a forest. So sometimes we just advise them, it's good if you are going through the same problem, then it's good to come together. And then if you speak with one voice, things will get done than an individual penetrating. So we are able to form a resident association whereby we attend the meeting. We call it resident association meeting. So we do that with them and then facilitate the meeting. And then if there's any issue concern that they want us to cancel, we do that. So that is one of the greatest achievements, because I remember each time we go on the door knocking, especially if it is high rise, they have the same issue, the same problem. Just okay, why can't we just a meeting, association meeting, like park? We normally go for the, to Portsea for the meeting. So we make sure we do all that. And then one thing again is when I made myself available to residents and I put smile on their face when I'm able to resolve their issues and concerns and their problem. That's one of the achievements. And I remember I can give one example. I have 1 or 2 residents that came to me. They pay deposit to letting agents, and the letting agents refused to give them their, though they didn't give them house. So, but because I stepped in, I emailed them. I'm like, okay, what is the issue? If you refuse to give these people housing, and it's not, the fault is not theirs, I think by law you need to return their money back to them. And 2 occasions like that, I've helped 2 residents in getting their money back from letting agents. So I'm proud of that. That's an achievement to be. So being able to accessible to the resident, make myself available to the resident and all that, I think is an achievement.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So last question, just quickly to round things off. So if money and process was no object, what's the one thing you would change about the way that the council is run? And can I pass that first to Yinka?
Oh yes, the one thing I would change about the council, about how the council works, is to make it more transparent and accountable. And I think the council should be more open and honest with the public about its decision, actions, and performance. So it should also be more responsive and responsible to the feedback, suggestions, and complaints from the public. So that is, and apart from that, I don't know if it's right, but I'm thinking, will it not be better if you run the election once in 4 years instead of every year? If they can change that, because I think it's just a waste of time, waste of money. And then we have what we call election period in March. That means they are running the council at a loss in that period. So why not change it to once in 4 years? I know there will be by-election, but it will reduce the money spending and all that. So that is my suggestion, or what I would like to change anyway.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Yinka. So Cal, yourself, is there one thing that you'd well, there's probably more than one thing, but what would be the if you were given that magic wand, what's the first thing that would change on your list?
Yeah, so in terms of how the council runs and its processes, Yinka stole my one actually. I wanted to talk about, but I will make the point anyway because I've got a few additional kind of issues to raise. Moving to all-out elections. As people know, at the moment, we have local elections 3 out of every 4 years, kind of with 1 year off and then back into the cycle where a third of councillors are up for election at any one time. I think moving to all-out elections every 4 years, which the council does have the power to do, and that's how some other local authorities choose to run their election processes, I think it's got a couple of kind of key benefits. And probably the most important for me is that I think it would encourage longer-term strategic thinking and policy making. at the moment, we're almost constantly in this cycle of May elections, an administration gets in, they maybe spend 3 months optimistically implementing their policy priorities, and then the next 9 months are fighting the next election, and so on and so on. But when we look at some of the issues that we're facing, I mean, I'll take the one I talked about earlier, the climate crisis, meeting the net zero challenge. The local authority and all of us as a city and a country and a population around the world are going to have to realistically make massive changes to the way we live and the way we organise our lives. And to do that, we need long-term strategic thinking. We don't need to be obsessed with elections coming up every single year. We need to be able to give people the opportunity to get into power and then have a period of time of at least a couple of years where they can start to make some of these changes, let them bed in. Some of these changes might be controversial in the short run, and in fact probably will be, but I do think they are necessary and probably will work out for the best in the longer term. So we need to allow them time to bed in, allow people time to adjust to the changes that are being made or that hopefully they're involved in making to their lives. So for me, that's a real key reason. I think there's a couple of other ones as well that I was mentioning. I think people do suffer from a little bit of voter fatigue in terms of having local elections every year. Clearly, we go and knock on people's doors every year, and quite often there is that conversation as, why are you back? We had this conversation a few months ago. Oh, well, there's local elections again. Oh, what? So you're up for election? No, I'm not up for election. It's one of the other councillors. And it's confusing, I think. I don't think people really understand how the process works. I think it would be much more straightforward and give people the opportunity to engage with it in a much more meaningful way if it was like a general election every 4 years or so. Because then they know, look, we had an election a few years ago. Do I think that things have changed for the better in my area? Have my local representatives been engaging? Have they done stuff for the community? We've given them a bit of time. Now we can make and have that judgment on whether we want to vote them back in or not. And the last point I would mention might be being a bit optimistic here, so let me know if you think this is ridiculously naive, but I would hope that having local elections every 4 years might lead to a little bit less tribalism on the council. I think, again, one of the issues at the moment is that disincentivises councillors and political parties from working together on important local issues is that they know they're going to be fighting them for votes in a couple of months' time. If it was a 4-year period, then maybe for the first 1 or 2 years at least, there might be opportunities for a little bit of cooperation where people aren't kind of obsessed with how that's going to look at the ballot box in a few months' time. So yeah, a few reasons why I think all-out elections would be good. It's interesting that Yinka's also mentioned it, because I do think it is something that could help. It might seem a little bit technocratic to some people, but yeah, based on my experience, I think it would be a positive change.
Yeah, and in our experience, sorry, Yinka, carry on.
Yes, I was just saying it's very stressful, to be honest, running election campaigning and everything. It can be very, very, very stressful for candidates, for councillors, because you can't leave your colleague when they are running their campaign. You need to join them doing that together. So it can be very, very stressful.
Absolutely, and I'm sure sometimes come in those February-March full council meetings, we do see motions that we think might perhaps be for the benefits of leaflets to be written in April, but that might be us being cynical. So Yinka, Cal, thank you very much for your time. That's been absolutely excellent. So you've been listening to the Pompey Politics podcast. I've been Ian Tiny Morris.
And our guests have been Councillor Cal Corkery and Councillor Yinka Adeniran. Thank you both.
Thank you very much for your time. Cheers, everyone.
Thank you so much for inviting us. And we hope to join you again very soon.
We'd love to have you back. Both of you are fantastic. So thank you very much. And our regular listeners can also join us at our usual time next Sunday, unless something else goes wrong. But either way, you can like, follow, subscribe wherever you consuming our content, either on Facebook, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please do follow along. I've been Simon Sansbury, and we'll see you next week at 6:27.